Hey y'all, here at OS Reviews. A couple of weeks back, we did a throwback review on the iPad Mini 2 almost a decade later, and as an ultra-budget tablet for around $30 on the used marketplace, it surprisingly still has some basic functionality and life left in it. But today we're doing another revisited review, this time of a newer iPad Mini, the 4th generation variant. First, in terms of cost, the iPad Mini 4 can be found for around $50 to $60 when shopping around, so it is going to be a little bit more than the iPad Mini 2, but I'd argue that this brings you closer to a much more modern UI as well as level of usability, and the number of upgrades are quite substantial. For one, the iPad Mini 2 and 3, which use the same processor, can run up to iOS version 12 versus the iPad Mini 4 goes all the way up to iPad OS 15. So that is 3 generations newer and more importantly supports widgets on the home screen, overall looking and acting a lot closer to the iPad OS that we know and love today, even on the newest iPads on the market. It also has double the RAM of the iPad Mini 2 and 3. These had 1 GB versus this one has 2 GB. Granted, that's nothing spectacular, but I'd argue that hardware specs in a vacuum have never looked outstanding on Apple products. It's really the optimization that does a lot of the heavy lifting, and twice the amount of RAM does allow you to open more applications. In addition, the Mini 4 was the first iPad to give us a fully laminated IPS LCD screen, so there is no more gap between the glass and the LCD underneath. There's less glare and reflections compared to earlier gens that had more of that gap underneath. The Mini 4 was also the lightest and most compact iPad mini at the time, weighing approx 300 grams or 0.6 pounds, and this was about 33 grams lighter than the preceding models, while still retaining the same 2K resolution, which is very sharp on this Retina 7.9-inch display that has that boxy 4:3 aspect ratio, which iPads are now known for. On 6.5-inch, 6.8-inch phones, keep in mind that the aspect ratio is a lot taller or more stretched. So you still are getting a noticeable increase in surface area to work with, especially for things like aforementioned web browsing. Anyways, this was powered by the Apple A8 processor, which was a dual-core 1.8 GHz chipset, a nice upgrade from the previous gen model, although still dual-core instead of, say, quad or octa-core, but still faster and more energy efficient than the earlier generation models. And like most iPads, battery life was also very good. Even now, if you're looking at a used unit, they should be able to last for at the minimum 2 or 3 days without requiring you to top up, originally with 10 hours of screen on time that in a used model you can expect with battery degradation closer to maybe 6 or 7 hours, has very minimal power draw. In fact, overnight it drains maybe less than 1% compared to on Android and other more demanding platforms. You'll notice more of that difference when you revisit the device. The bottom here also houses Touch ID for fingerprint recognition. That also serves as a physical home key, working quite well. Also something that the Mini 2 from earlier does not have. It makes authentication and not having to worry about passwords also quite convenient. Again, this thing is very slim and still is super impressive even here in 2023, just how lightweight it is, but constructed of course out of this unibody piece of aluminum alloy that feels quite premium. With that being said, like all iPads, unfortunately memory cannot be upgraded. The base model came with just 16 gigabytes and there was up to a 128 gigabyte variant. So if you are picking one up or considering it, make sure to get the memory version that you need right from the get-go. The back also houses a 8 megapixel autofocus camera, but no LED flash. The bottom here houses, of course, the lightning port for charging, taking about 2.5 to 3 hours to fully top up. There was stereo speakers built on in, although they were all placed on the side. And then on the right-hand spine, there's access to a volume rocker, very tactile. Of course, a cellular model, like the one that we have here in this video, has this antenna band, and that supports a SIM card on the side. The top here houses just a power key and also a standard 3.5mm headphone jack. It was really until the iPad Mini 6 when Apple refreshed the aesthetics on the front in terms of a larger screen-to-body ratio and smaller bezels, but until the Mini 5, everything is still quite similar in terms of appearance. And the form is not too far off from something like a Kindle as well, which is actually quite convenient. It's going to be slimmer than even a standard novel and easy enough to carry with you. So taking a closer look at the UI, if you have used any recent iPad or even iPhone, you'll be pretty much right at home. So aside from the widget support, we can add additional pages of content. You can also drag down to launch universal search, and also further go over to the right to get you a full list of applications. Then a swipe to the left, access some additional widgets that you could take a look at a glance. What I will say though is the Apple A8 processor, though it was very fast for the time, is definitely starting to show its age a bit, especially with the presence of more animations and widgets on the home screen. It definitely starts to boggle down a bit. You can see moments of hesitation when scrolling back and forth, so it's not necessarily quite as buttery smooth as on an earlier gen of the OS, where it has less work to do in terms of the graphics. But nonetheless, everything is still serviceable and doesn't get overly annoying to use, I would say, as long as you have your expectations tempered. Gesture here allows you to access commands for wireless connectivity, as well as screen brightness, whereas on the middle you can drag down to access any notifications which show up. And one thing that I have to admit Apple has done really well on has to be optimization for the larger tablet form factor. So for example, it's really only until a month or two ago when Google announced the Google Pixel tablet, when Android finally received a dock functionality at the bottom of their OS, which is something that iPads have been giving us for a while now, and it's pretty convenient to use for gestures and navigating around. Many apps take advantage of the larger screen size by providing split screen views for context menus, whether it's settings, in the email app, notes apps, and they're all pretty well integrated, though you can still find the odd app that is stretched, primarily designed for iPhones and smaller screens being scaled up. I would say it is rare compared to the Android world, where kind of the popularity of Android tablets have dwindled in the last 2 or 3 years, and as a result, developers have less of an incentive to create a custom version of the app to fill a larger space. But that's not quite as true on iPads, which are still kind of the leader in terms of market share for tablets, and so we do have more of an optimized user experience. The screen here again being super sharp and still very bright, filled with color and saturation. The only downside again is sometimes you have to wait a few extra seconds for apps to open. So let's take a quick look at how web browsing works now, such as The Verge. We can tap to proceed. You can tell that, again, it's going to take a few extra seconds for everything to completely render, especially for pages that are heavier with lots of videos and elements. I think the extra RAM and processor is definitely making a difference versus the Mini 2 and 3, which in comparison just took even longer to load. But on here, I think it's still perfectly serviceable. Content, again, still looks sharp, good for reading, and things like articles really pose no problem for this tablet. Now, notably, once you start using the tablet for longer than, say, 30 minutes, heavier tasks, it does have a tendency to get a little bit warmer now, notably on the right-hand corner region. So it's not necessarily thermal throttling, but just something to keep in mind. So takeaway being that the speakers are definitely not shabby. They get louder than on certain smartphones because of bigger room for drivers, but you don't get quite as much stereo separation since they're all placed at the bottom there, but decent volume. And again, you can always use headphones or Bluetooth, including AirPods do work when paired with this for another more private listening experience. Again, the screen, like we talked about, does have a bit of a letterboxing effect for media content, but the takeaway is it's still sharp enough, bright enough to enjoy content, and in general, things are still quite fast to load. Reception quality in terms of antennas tend to be very good, so I was consistently getting almost full bars for Wi-Fi as well as cellular too, so you don't have to waiting too long for content to buffer and play back, and the UI here is still looking quite nice and up to date when it comes to loading back content and enjoying it. You can also access picture-in-picture mode just because it is running on iPad OS and doing a bit of additional multitasking on this larger display. Camera performance is just adequate. It's fine for a tablet. Overall, I just expect it to be good enough for scanning in documents, which this thing certainly suffices for that. You also have a basic HDR mode, although some of the more advanced AI modes like automatic text recognition and cropping may not be available here, with text details still looking sharp enough, and if you're snapping the occasional portrait or landscape shot, it works out all right. And similar remarks for the webcam. It's nothing to write home about, especially in terms of resolution in darker situations, but for some limited FaceTime calls and selfies, it will work okay in a pinch. In general, though, it's impressive how well it's keeping up after getting 6 OS level updates and the fact that we can still run multiple apps in the background. Now, speaking of applications, I would say right now in the store, you're able to download 90, if not 95% of apps. The remaining 5 to 10% being brand new apps that were launched in the past few months, which may start to require iOS 16 or newer to run, such as the ChatGPT app. But for most of the other legacy apps, including social media apps, whether it's YouTube, Instagram, WhatsApp, they can all still run on here without any issues. And another note here is if you do have an iPhone, which is running on a newer version of iOS, and you already have downloaded that app or own the app on the iPhone, you can also download it on the iPad and choose an older version, which is supported by the iPad. So that's kind of a workaround. If you do have another iOS device that's newer and you get it there first, you can also get it on the other device and it will automatically install the last compatible version. So overall, in terms of the app situation, I would say it's not bad, but of course, with any aging piece of tech, one thing to keep in mind is going further out, it's not going to receive any additional updates, and so the condition will further deteriorate from here. In 2023, at the very least, it still is what I would consider a pretty functional tablet. Light entertainment and very basic games, which are maybe puzzle style, can still be run all right. But again, if you need anything that's heavier or newer, that could also be a reason to consider a newer iPad. So that is more or less it as far as our revisited look at the iPad mini 4. It's by no means the newest, latest, greatest, but the price also reflects that. And if all you need is just a simple tablet for tasks like doing a bit of reading, accessing your emails on a larger display, you can even connect it to a Bluetooth keyboard, basic content consumption, then I think this is actually really not a bad choice. Again, compared to a entry-level Amazon Fire tablet, which retails for a similar cost, you're getting a higher PPI on the screen that looks better for photos and content, as well as a better build quality. You can check out additional details in the links down below. But for now, that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That's been a look back at the iPad mini 4 here in 2023.